Well, good evening from London and welcome to the latest of our Harif Zoom talks. My name is Lynn Julius and I'm ably assisted here on the technical side by Lawrence. Harif, for those who are new to us, is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And we aim to raise awareness of the history, the heritage, and the culture of these Jews. We've got a website, www.harif.org, and there you will find all the details of our forthcoming events, mostly on Zoom. Anyone on the mailing list gets login details automatically, and it's all for free. Just to say that we are a very small band of volunteers working at Harif, and we are a non-profit. We've got a sister website called Point of No Return, which is a news blog updated every day. We have about 8,000 posts on all different aspects of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews, and it's really become quite a useful archive for those who are interested. And to access it, all you have to do is click on News on the Harif website. This session is being recorded, which I'm sure will be very useful for those who are asleep at the moment and who would like to catch up with this session. Hopefully, the recording will be up on the Harif website within a matter of hours. And to access it, just click on videos. We hope to have questions from you, comments. As Lawrence said, please do use your real name. Otherwise, we won't be allowed to pose a question. Please do write your comment or your question in the chat, which is the button on the bottom of your screen. So on to tonight's topic. Baghdadi Jews, or rather Jews who left the Middle East to establish communities in India and the Far East, have often been the focus of our talks here at Harif. And we've had speakers on Indonesia, on Borneo, India, of course, Shanghai, Japan, the Philippines, and of course the Sassoons and the Kaduris. We've had Jay Prosser talk about his memoir, Loving Strangers, where he talks about his mother's Singaporean background. But we haven't yet had a talk about the community of Jews in Singapore until tonight. And who better than to have Geraldine Goodfin, who is an expert on the subject. And thank you to Nathalie Dweck for introducing us. So our speaker, Geraldine Goodfin, is a historian of modern Jewish life and a visiting scholar at the Center for Asian Legal Studies at the National University of Singapore. Her current research focuses on Baghdadi Jewish family life in Asia between the 1880s and the 1950s. And she is the co-creator of the Mahala Project Instagram page, which is a public initiative on Jewish histories in the city of Singapore. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Geraldine, and to thank you so much for getting up in the middle of the night at 2:30 a.m. in Singapore and for giving us this presentation. Thank you very much.
Lynn, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation in the first place. It's really exciting to talk tonight, especially because I have found that through my new research project on Baghdadi Jewish history, I've got to connect to so many people all over the world because for reasons that we'll explore during today's talk, people who belong to the community, Jewish community in Singapore became very dispersed after World War II. Which means that there are people throughout the globe, in places like London, LA, Sydney, and other places who have ties, family ties, historical ties to the Jewish community in Singapore. And so I view this talk as an opportunity to talk about this little known community to people who might never really have heard of it, but also an opportunity to connect with people who share that history and who might be interested in connecting with me. Well, if there's a bit of time at the end of the talk, I would love to hear from people who are connected to this history. And so you mentioned Jay. We're actually working very closely with Jay because when I moved to Singapore 2 years ago, I became very interested in his work, and luckily for me, he visited Singapore shortly after I had moved here, so we got to meet and become very good friends and colleagues. And Jay's my partner in crime with this Mahala Project Instagram page. It's one of the many projects we have, so we're very slowly building content. But if anyone wants to reach out with stories, um, artifacts, or anything that they want to contribute to the Instagram, you're more than welcome. And maybe we can come back to this topic at the very end of the talk. Um, so the first thank you is to Yulin, and I also want to thank two other people. The first one is Ben Benjamin, who is really the mastermind behind this wonderful project at the Magen Avot Synagogue, which is the Jews of Singapore Museum, which was opened almost 5 years ago during the pandemic, I think. And it's an opportunity for people to really explore the history of the Jews in Singapore. So for anyone who plans to visit Singapore in the near future, please stop at the museum. And Ben agreed to share a lot of the photographs from the museum's collection with me, and I use them in my talk today. So I really want to give credit where the credits are due. And my third thank you is to David Isaac, who is a very good friend of mine here in Singapore, and one of the few Baghdadi Jews really left in Singapore. So today the community is about, I think, 2,000 people. And most of them are expats. Some of them are quite transient. They come to Singapore for a few years before, going back to Australia or the US or wherever they're from. And they're also expats who have established deep roots in Singapore and have become permanent residents. But so what I mean to say is that there are not that many Baghdadi Jewish families left here in Singapore, but the people who have remained and, really continued being really active members both of the Jewish community and of Singapore's broader life, are very dedicated to preserving the heritage and memory of Baghdadi Jews in Singapore. And David has been at the forefront of doing that. Through the talk, I really wanted to honor the memory of his grandmother, Phyllis Isaacs, who played a really major role in rebuilding the Jewish community of Singapore after World War II. So thank you to everyone I just mentioned. So now I can launch into the PowerPoint. Let me learn if there's any issue with it. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Len, how is it? Can everyone see? Perfect. Okay, great. Okay. So today I want to give you a journey into the history of Baghdadi Jews in Singapore. And Lynn actually picked the title for the lecture, but I love it because it's really the notion of building ties to urban heritage and traces of the Jewish past in Singapore, which you can see here on the slide. That this is the Magen Avot Synagogue. There are two synagogues in Singapore. The first one is the Magen Avot Synagogue, which you can see here, which was built in 1878. And the second one is the Chesed El Synagogue, which was established in 1905. But the question of building goes beyond just physical traces of the heritage. There's also a metaphorical aspect to the notion of building, which is really nation building and making a home in Singapore. And that's also a theme I want to explore in the lecture today. So let's start with this picture from 1978. So in 1978, the Jewish community of Singapore celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Magen Avot synagogue, which was very much cause for celebration. And at a dinner organized um, to celebrate the anniversary, the Foreign Minister of Singapore, S. Rajaratnam, uttered the following words. The contributions the Singapore Jews have made to the development of Singapore is out of all proportion to their numbers, which goes to show that what counts is quality and not quantity. And that really sums up, I think, the theme of this lecture, which is that historically, Jews have represented quite a small community in Singapore, but their contributions to Singapore, really since its founding as a trading port by the British in 1819 up to this day, have been really crucial to the city's development or to the country's development. And among two of the people who have been very much at the core of the efforts to build an active Jewish community and a prosperous country are two people that you can see on this picture. So the first one is someone that some of you might be familiar with. It's David Marshall, who was the first chief minister of Singapore in 1955 and 1956. And you can see a woman right behind him, and this woman is Phyllis Isaacs. So those are two individuals that I really want to highlight in the lecture. But let's go back really to the origins of the Jewish community in Singapore. So as I just mentioned, the British founded Singapore as a trading port in 1819. So before that, Singapore was actually a very small fishing village inhabited by Malay people. So really from 1819 onwards, you have the development of this small village into a very cosmopolitan center that would bring people from all over the world. And today's demographic makeup really reflects this. So today, the majority of the population of Singapore is Chinese, because in the 19th century, many Chinese people came to Singapore. There are still Malay people who trace their roots to kind of the earlier origins of Singapore. And there is also a significant Indian population. Again, there are other groups, but those are the main groups in Singapore today. So you can see in today's demographic makeup, kind of the earlier colonial origin of Singapore. So how do Jews fit into this? Well, Jews have been in Singapore pretty much since the early 19th century when the British came to Singapore. And the reason for this is that the Baghdadi Jews were quite involved in the British Empire. As early as the late 18th century, Baghdadi Jews, and here I should pause by saying that Baghdadi Jews are not merely from Baghdad, but they're actually from the Middle East writ large, especially what is today Syria and Iraq. So Baghdadi Jews started coming to India with the British in the late 18th century. And I'm sure, Lynn, that they might have been some Harif talks about Jews in India and the Baghdadi Jewish community in India.
Yes,
and so some of you can look at those videos online. And from India, some Baghdadi Jews migrated eastward towards Southeast Asia. So here you can see this on this wonderful map. You can see the kind of the various waves of migration from the Middle East eastward towards India, and then Southeast Asia, and then all the way to China. And this map is really important because when we talk about Singapore, we really need to understand that Baghdadi Jews were part of a kind of a broader transnational mercantile network. So within the lifetime of one individual, that person could have been born in Singapore, but then moved to Surabaya in Indonesia, Penang in what is today Malaysia, Kolkata, et cetera, et cetera. So all these points throughout the Baghdadi diaspora were very much connected with each other, conducting trade with one another, marrying each other across the diaspora. And there was really extreme mobility. And so I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but we have to really keep in mind that the Jewish community in Singapore was not at all insular, that it was connected to a broader Baghdadi world and a broader colonial world more generally. Um, so one family, of course, that people associate with the Baghdadi diaspora in Asia is the Sassoon family, which became very prominent in Asia and are often referred to as the Rothschild of the East. So there actually are Sassoons in Singapore, but I believe that they're a different branch than the Sassoons that we usually think of when we think about Baghdadi Jewish life. Okay, so this is, to my knowledge, one of the earliest traces that we have of Jews in Singapore. And I found this a few weeks ago while conducting research, and I thought this was a kind of a fascinating artifact. So this was a testimonial plate, um, which was given by residents of Singapore to the governor of Singapore, General Butterworth, who was on his way to retiring and going back to England. And this object, I don't know if the object still exists, if it's in a private collection at a museum somewhere. I have not been able to trace it, but I found an illustration of it in the Illustrated London News, which shows you what the artifact would actually have looked like. And what the newspaper described is that this plate contains the figures of three men, one Chinese, one Malay, and an Indian Jew over whom Britannia holds her shield in allusion to her protection. And I find this so fascinating because we know that they were Baghdadi Jews from the beginning of the establishment of Singapore. But here it shows you that Jews were really seen as kind of central mercantile actors for the British, and that they really stood as central protagonists in the history of the development of Singapore alongside the Chinese and the Malay population. And the reason he mentioned Indian Jew is that, as I mentioned earlier, Baghdadi Jews in Singapore had come from India. So they were not part of the much more established Indian communities like the Bnei Israel or the Kachini Jews. They were more recent arrival from the Middle East into Asia. So I wanted to bring actually some clippings from the colonial newspapers that shows how the British understood the identity of those Middle Eastern Baghdadi Jews in colonial Singapore. So I brought two different newspaper articles that were published in the colonial press, one from 1887 and the other one from 1905. And the key element that I want to emphasize here is that the British authorities viewed them as quote unquote Arab Jews. And this is very interesting in light of current contemporary discussions about Mizrahi Jewish identities. There are people especially with the Iraqi background, who have really claimed that label to emphasize their Middle Eastern roots. But what I find really interesting is that through the course of my research, I found that Arab Jews was actually the term that the British used to describe Baghdadi Jews in Singapore. And part of the reason they did this is that, of course, the Jews who came to Singapore in the 19th century were very much Middle Eastern, right? They ate Middle Eastern food, they dressed in a Middle Eastern garb, they spoke Arabic, especially Judeo-Arabic, and they brought this with them. So to the British authorities, they very much presented as Middle Easterners. So I will read the first, sorry, let me move. Okay, so on the first article, which you can see on the left, this is actually a description from the Magen Avraham synagogue, which had been built 9 years earlier in 1878. And it was, I think, a Rosh Hashanah celebration that this writer attended. And you can see also kind of the Orientalizing language that he uses when describing these worshippers. So he writes, so here, okay, sorry. Here, about 30 Arab Jews and nearly as many Europeans are assembled to praise the God of their fathers. And here, I think it's important also to note that although we do associate Singapore with Baghdadi Jews, they were also non-Baghdadi Jews, especially European traders. So it was in some ways a mixed community. There was more um, interaction between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim that one might assume in the first place. So many are attired in the picturesque Oriental costume with its bright colors and flowing robes, so suggestive of scripture picture books coned over on Sunday evenings long, long ago, before the world had hardened our hearts and dimmed our faith. There is a purple dress with a cap of scarlet that my eyes feast on with all its warmth of color. Another dress is of pale green satin, worn by a patriarch with a venerable white beard and of commanding presence. This is the chief rabbi. I am told so this is the chief rabbi, I am told. And his daughter, who bends over from the women's gallery, reminds one of Sir Walter Scott's description of Rebecca. The white sheet that envelops her half reveals and half conceals the form within. So I'm going to stop here, but here, I mean, we could spend really the whole lecture unpacking this text, but it's really interesting how they present this Jewish worshippers as biblical like figures, or kind of those Oriental apparitions from the past. And there's a lot of commentaries we can unpack on this, but it really shows you the ways in which they viewed the Baghdadi Jews of Singapore. So now I have a source that is from a bit later. This is from turn of the 20th century Singapore. And this article is titled How Onions Grow in the Sea. So the article read, an Arab Lascar caused considerable trouble in the police court yesterday through his inability to speak anything but Arabic. So here the assumption is that the person who ended up in police court was a Muslim Arab, because usually when it's a Jewish person, the press mention Arab Jew. So Arab without any further adjective usually refers to a Muslim. A Jew was finally found to act as interpreter. The Arab was accused of fraudulent possession of 15 cents worth of onions at Tajang Pagar. He said that he picked them up in the sea. He was advised not to do it again and discharged. So here, this source is really fascinating because I actually found this alongside other articles that show that Arab Jews were often used in courts as interpreters. So they were not official interpreters, but because they were often multilingual, they spoke Arabic alongside other languages, including English. The authorities would actually use them as interpreters when they were Arabic-speaking individuals who were not able to speak English or any other language that would have been intelligible to the authorities. So you really see here those quote-unquote Arab Jews being intermediaries between different parts of colonial society. Okay, so among the people who came from India to Singapore was someone who turned out to be very influential in the history of the Jewish community, and this was Sir Manasseh Meyer, who became really one of the most successful individuals, not only in the Jewish community but in Singapore writ large. He was a trader. He was involved in all kinds of things, including real estate. So Manasseh Meyer actually bought property in really a large chunk of Singapore, including the area that is around the Chesed Al Synagogue. So the Chesed Al Synagogue was actually originally built by Manasseh Meyer as quote unquote his private synagogue. So if you ever go to the Magen Avraham synagogue, you're facing the synagogue, you go past the synagogue on the left side, you can see a little staircase. And if you climb it up, you would see what used to be, so now it's all been destroyed now, they're modern building, but this actually was Manasseh Meyer's property. And a lot of this property was later on sold, and the money was put. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of how the trust, etc. But my understanding is that a lot of the money that was made from selling his property has benefited the Jewish community to this day. So when we think about the Jewish builders of Singapore, we have to really understand that a lot of the wealth of the community was established by people like Manasseh Meyer, and that to this day, it benefits the community writ large. not just the descendants of those really successful individuals, but anyone who worships at Magen Avot or Chesed El or attends the Shabbat lunches or anything related to communal life. Uh, in part, it's been secured by the labor of those earlier builders of the Jewish community in Singapore. And you can see here, the important thing to know about Manasseh Meir is that you can see from his clothing that he was quite acculturated to British culture, to British sartorial norms. But he was an observant Jew throughout his life, and he put it in a lot of efforts into making sure that the community would remain observant. So a few words about the process of acculturation that these Baghdadi Jewish families underwent. So as a result of their involvement in British life, many Jewish families became anglicized. And I think the dress is a great way to really understand this. So we saw in the newspaper articles that the focus was really on their Middle Eastern garb. And so what you see here on those photos is quite different. You see people who dress really like British aristocrats. But if you zoom in, I can't really zoom in here, but if you zoom in on the picture on the right, you see that little girl with a little bow in her hair. So actually on one of her wrists, she's wearing an amulet, which is, as many of you know, very much core of Baghdadi culture, Baghdadi spirituality and mysticism, right? So I think many historians have really emphasized the Anglicization of Baghdadi Jews, not only in Singapore, but in India and Southeast Asia. But what gets lost in those narrative is that in many ways, Baghdadi Jews were English presenting, but also retained many aspects of their Baghdadi Jewish culture. So, of course, those aspects might have been kind of toned down, attenuated, but that doesn't mean that they completely relinquished their Middle Eastern origins. Far from this. So talking about the elite of the Baghdadi Jewish community, this is a very important visit, which occurred in 1922, which is Albert Einstein's visits to Singapore. So Einstein came in 1922 to raise funds for what would become the Hebrew University. And he wrote in his diary that the funds that he was able to obtain in Singapore was the private donation that he had received at this point for the Hebrew University. So again, when we think about Singapore Jews, we can see that it was very much far from insular, that it wasn't only that Baghdadi Jews had ties to other Baghdadi Jews in the community, but that Baghdadi Jews in Singapore were connected to the broader Jewish world. And so I just spoke about Manasseh Meir. You can see Manasseh Meir here sitting on Albert Einstein's left side. And on the picture, actually, it's not only Baghdadi Jews, there were also some Ashkenazi members of the Singapore Jewish community, which again shows you that the community was more quote unquote mixed than one might assume. Again, talking about acculturation, this was a coronation tea that was held in 1937. So you can see here belonging to the British Empire and really full belonging into the kind of aristocratic life of the British. And so some of the prominent members of the Singapore Jewish community really left traces of their Judaism that you can see in the city to this day. So actually the picture on the right side is that of a building that no longer exists. It was the house of the Penchas family, which was destroyed to make way for more modern buildings. And this really speaks to the way in which part of the heritage of the Singapore Jewish community has disappeared due to really the modernization efforts and the modern building of Singapore after the war. So that's one example. But another example is the cemetery. So on what is really the heart of the city today on Orchard Road, there was historically a Jewish cemetery. And in the 1980s, the community actually had to exhume all the bodies and move them either some of them were moved to Israel, otherwise they were moved to another Jewish cemetery, which is really at the edge of the city today. And so a lot of the traces of the earlier waves of Jewish settlers in Singapore have been erased by the urban building of Singapore. Uh, but thankfully for all of us, there are buildings that remain, and one of them is the David Elias building, which you can see on the left side of of my slide here. So this is a building that was built by David Elias, who was a merchant in the early 1920s. And what is really significant is that on both those buildings, and this is true of many other buildings, they were not the only building that looked like this, but on both those buildings, you see Stars of David, and not just one, multiple ones. So you can really see how the Jewishness of those Baghdadi Jews made it into the landscape of Singapore and is still visible to this day. Uh, Other traces that we have of Jewish life in Singapore is that a lot of the elite members of the Baghdadi Jewish community in Singapore made contributions to the city that own them to have streets named after them. So throughout Singapore, you have a lot of cities that are actually named after Baghdadi Jews. Like Nassim, for instance, is an Elias, Nassim, et cetera, et cetera. I'm happy to share more about this later. Okay, so um, now I want to talk a little bit more about class. Because when we look at, those buildings and the photos of those, wealthy, aristocratic looking individuals, one might get a sense that everyone in the Baghdadi community, was well off and successful. And that certainly was not the case. And there are multiple explanations for this, but one explanation is that there were multiple waves of Baghdadi immigration to Singapore. All the way really to the early 20th century, Jews came into Singapore either from other parts of Southeast Asia or from South Asia, or even from Baghdad. So I've spoken in Singapore to several individuals whose grandparents came from Baghdad or Basra to Singapore in the early 20th century, right? And so this is really important because that explains that even though all these people could claim the label of Baghdadi Jews, they actually had different cultures. If you came to Singapore in the 1850s from India, or if you came from Basra in 1910, well, your culture would be a little bit different. And so there were very important class differences. And the poorest of the community lived in what was called at the time the Makhala, which is a broader Arabic term that is used really throughout the Arabic-speaking Jewish world to describe Jewish neighborhoods. And the Makhala was actually the area around Magen Avot. You had a cluster of streets around the synagogue where Iraqi immigrants or poorer families would live. And of course, their life had very little to do with the life of the, Baghdadi elite, such as the, Manasseh mayor. And they were actually major class divides within the community itself, very little intermingling between the very rich and the poor. And this had ramifications also more generally for how the British authorities perceived Baghdadi Jews. So to really kind of sum it up, while the elite of the community were seen as quote unquote Europeans, even though they didn't have European roots, the poor members of the community, especially those in the Makhala, were seen as Asian. And this is a label that actually was used by David Marshall himself when he referred to himself as an Asian Jew. And those labels really spoke to the socio-economic and class divides within the community itself. Okay, so now I want to talk about two individuals who made really important contribution to both to the Jewish community and to Singapore writ large. So the first one is David Marshall, and the second one is Felix Isaac. So Phyllis Isaacs is not as well known because she wasn't a politician, she wasn't a well-known criminal lawyer, but I really wanted to mention her because her efforts were really crucial for rebuilding the community after the war, and also because when we focus too much on institutional histories or political history, often it's to the detriment of Jewish women's history. So of course, all of us know that Jewish women matter and that their lives mattered to the life of the community, but often we erase them because they didn't hold positions of power. And so I really wanted to make sure that we honored these two individuals through the lecture today. Okay, so first let's start with David Marshall. So David Marshall family was originally from Iraq, and here you can actually see exactly what we described when we read the newspaper articles together. The Middle Eastern culture shows through their dress. So on the left side you have Shmuel Satka, who was David's great-grandfather, and on the right side you have his grandparents, Farha Satka and Nissim Mashal. So Mashal was actually the Arabic family name, which was anglicized to Marshall when the family moved to Singapore. So David Marshall grew up actually in the Machala. He grew up is when he was a young child. His family was not at all well-to-do, but in the 1920s, his father started having much more success with his business. And that allowed for David to actually travel to Europe and receive an education in the UK. So in the 1920s, he did several trips to Switzerland. The first one I think was in 1926 because he had TB, tuberculosis, and it was common for people who had tuberculosis at the time and who could afford to go to Europe to travel to Switzerland to recover. And that in part explains why David Marshall became completely fluent in French, and later on, many decades later, served as Singapore's ambassador to France in the 70s, I believe. And so what I love about this photo is that you see in the middle a young David Marshall, young and proud, and on the right, you see Tan Hatta, who became Singapore's first Asian Supreme Court judge in the 1950s. So you can see really how the connections that he made as a young man in the 1920s and 30s would later on become really foundational to his career as a politician, but mainly as a lawyer. So in the 1930s, he went to London and was educated, and he came back to Singapore and became the first Jewish judge in Singapore. Okay, so the other person I want to mention today is Phyllis Isaacs, who was born actually not in Singapore, but in Surabaya. But her own childhood really attests to the diasporic nature of Baghdadi Jews, because though she was born and spent the first years of her life in Surabaya in Indonesia, her parents actually had come from Singapore. And I think it really is important that even though today there's really practically no Jewish left in Indonesia, they were Jewish communities not only in Indonesia but also Malaysia, and that these communities were connected to the community of Singapore. And what's really interesting about Phyllis Isaacs is that her early childhood also complicates the vision that we have of Baghdadi Jews in Asia as being anglicized, because Phyllis Isaacs actually did not grow up speaking English because Indonesia was under Dutch rule. So the two languages that she spoke as a child were Dutch and Malay. And Malay was actually a language that was used by Baghdadi Jews in Indonesia, Malaysia, and what became Malaysia and Singapore. It was the language of commerce that many people used in their daily life. And so she describes, so in the 1980s, the National Archives of Singapore created this wonderful collection of oral histories And among the people that they interviewed members of the Jewish communities, including Felix Isaacs. And she described in the interview that the languages that were the secret languages that her parents used so that the kids would not understand were English and Arabic, right? So you can see again how those different interactions with colonial powers and the migrations really impacted everyday language and culture more generally. And she also describes in the interview that she actually picked up Arabic later on when she was interned by the Japanese in Indonesia. And I guess she had time to learn Arabic. And so one of her Baghdadi friend, who was an Arabic speaker, taught her Arabic during those years of Japanese occupation in Indonesia. Okay, so this brings me to the war. And this is something that people with ties to the region obviously would know. But many people associate, World War II and the Holocaust with Europe, naturally. So one thing that we really need to understand is that World War II was a global event that had ramifications very much for Jews throughout the world, including in Asia. And so the Japanese occupation authorities actually interned Jews, not only in the British colonies like Singapore, but also in Dutch colony, which is why even though Felix Isaacs grew up in a place that was ruled by the Dutch, and David Marshall grew up in Singapore, which was under British control. In both cases, they were interned by the Japanese. I mean, the David Marshall story is a bit different because he was an intern in Singapore, but we will return to this shortly. So the Actually, I am grappling a little bit with the question of the Japanese occupation in Singapore because there's not so much scholarship on this. So it's unclear to me, to be fully honest, what the motivations of the Japanese were for interning Jews and what could have happened if the war had lasted longer. So I have heard from two members of the community who were interned by the Japanese that they remember male members of their family pretty much digging what were to become their graves if liberation had not occurred. So I don't know to what extent the Nazis were putting pressure on the Japanese to really kill Jews in those different camps. I really don't know because some people might have questions on this. So here it's really a call for people who might have ties to that history and documents and oral histories to please reach out to me because I'm curious about what we can find about that time period that is relatively little known even in Singapore itself as far as it concerns the Jewish community. So one of the people who did write about what happened to the Jewish community in Singapore during the war years was Ezi Nathan, who was a leader in the Jewish community, who later on moved to the UK after the war. And in his book that he wrote about the Jewish community of Singapore, he described one of the encounters he had with a Japanese officer, and I'm going to read here from the slide. A Japanese officer stopped me in the street and examined my armband closely. "You what ka?" he asked. I answered in as firm a voice as I could muster. "I am a Jew." To my astonishment, he grasped my hand and shook it energetically, smiling broadly. "Ah, Jew," he exclaimed. "Very good. In the world, 3 great J's. 1, Japan. 2, Julius Caesar. 3, Jew." He let go of my hands as abruptly as he had seized it, turned on his heel, and walked away, leaving me more confounded than ever by the unpredictability of our Japanese masters. Okay, so this is, obviously a fascinating source, but it really sheds light on the very ambiguous relationship that Japanese forces had with the Jewish population. And here at the outset, we should also say that the treatment of Jewish prisoners in various parts of the Japanese occupied world really varied greatly. So we know, for instance, that The Jews who faced internment in the Dutch colonies, so including someone like Phyllis, faced a far harsher treatment in the hands of the Japanese than Jews in Singapore. So what happened in Singapore doesn't necessarily reflect all the experiences of Baghdadi Jews who were interned by the Japanese. But it's interesting that in another interview I listened to, there was a similar theme that emerged, and this is actually an interview that was conducted with Frederick Isaacs, who was the husband of Phyllis. They married after the war, and similarly to Phyllis, he was actually born and grew up in Surabaya. But his family later moved to Singapore. So by the time of the Japanese occupation, he was actually in Singapore, where he was interned by the Japanese. And he described that he was well treated by the Japanese, and that the Jews were somewhat treated better than other groups in the camps. So again, I would not universalize this testimony because I think it really varied, but it really begs more research as to kind of the very complex encounters between the Japanese and the Jews, especially Baghdadi Jews during the war. So here, we're not going to go through this in depth, but those are the numbers that actually Nathan shares in his book. And you can see the number of people who were interned. They were really three waves of internment in Singapore: 1942, 1943, and 1945. During the second wave, about 100 men, they were all men, were interned by the Japanese. But in 1945, so just a few months before the end of the war, the Japanese occupation forces actually interned the remainder of the community that was left in Singapore, including women and children. So there is a centenarian in the community here who was interned as a child well, she was her siblings were younger, but she was interned and survived the war in internment camp and has very vivid memories of her experience there. So now the number that might stood out on this slide is the number of evacuees. Because what happened is that because so many people had ties to India for reasons I described earlier, from the beginning of the occupation, many people really found rescue in India and were sheltered by their families, relatives, or other members of the Baghdadi community in India. And Jay is attending his lecture. I think he mentioned that his mother is also attending, and she was one of the children who left Singapore to find refuge in India during the war. So that was really crucial because that really saved the lives of many people who might have died of dysentery or other horrible things in internment camp. So here, so there were actually two camps, Changi and Simrod, and this is the Simrod camp. You can see kind of daily life in the camp on this slide. So now let's go back to Marshall, because David Marshall was actually imprisoned by the Japanese, but not in Singapore. He was imprisoned as a prisoner of war in Hokkaido, Japan, because Marshall volunteered as a member of the Street Settlement Volunteering Force to defend Singapore. So he was taken prisoner by the Japanese and taken to Hokkaido, where he spent 3 years of the war. And you can see on the right side, actually, a picture of David Marshall towards the end of the war, looking rather emaciated. And the warriors were really central to his thinking, not only about the future of Singapore, but also of humanity writ large. A lot of these ideas about social justice and humanity were drawn from his time as a prisoner of war in Japanese camp. So now I know we're moving at a fast pace, but we're limited by time. So now this brings us to post-war Singapore. So now it's very clear to us that for those who were left in Singapore, the warriors were very traumatic because of the violence inflicted by the Japanese, the trauma of the internment experience. And then there was also the bulk of the community that at this point was no longer in Singapore because they had found refuge in India and other places. So what happened to the community after the war? So after the war, the community had dwindled considerably. So before the war, there were approximately 2,000 to 300 individuals. After the war, if I remember the numbers correctly, it's about 200, right? So a very, very, very small community. And so people had to decide for themselves, where is the future? And here, when we look at the question of post-war Singapore Jewish life, we must put it in broader perspective, right? This is a context where the world has experienced, a bloody war, and it's also kind of the first um, well, this is really the time when calls for decolonization are picking up. So what it means is that the future is looking uncertain for Jewish communities everywhere. So to go back to India, for instance, the reason why there aren't so many Jews in India today is that after the war, and especially after decolonization, many Baghdadi Jews left India altogether to go to other places within the former British Empire. That's why you have many Baghdadi Jews in the UK or Australia, for instance. And this wasn't because they were expelled from India, but rather because of political uncertainty about where their future would be safer, right? So when we think about Jewish migrations after World War II, we think about the Holocaust, we think about waves of expulsion and persecution, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we really need to complexify this history, and we can do this when we look at Baghdadi Jews in Asia, because what we must understand is that the political situation in the wake of the war, in a context of decolonization, became very, very uncertain. And so as individuals and families, people had to decide, okay, where do I want to bet? Where will I have a better life? And so that in part explained the migration patterns after the war. Another thing that we must understand in the context of Southeast Asia is the fear of communism, right? So there really was a fear at the time that communists would take over. And in fact, there were, bloody conflicts around that question. And there was, in post-war Singapore, a lot of interracial, inter-ethnic violence, especially between the Chinese and the Malay population. And one of the really pivotal moments in Singapore's history is the Maria Ertag riots of 1950. So really in the wake of the war. And what were those riots? So those riots concern the fate of a girl. And again, this ties to World War II. The fate of a little girl who was born to Dutch parent. And her parents were interned during World War II. And they before being interned, they entrusted their child, Maria, to a Malay Muslim woman. And so that young girl was raised by a Malay Muslim woman, and she observed Muslim costumes. She was very much immersed in the Malay Muslim world. And after the war, when the Japanese were no longer occupying the region, her Dutch parents sought to get her back to the Netherlands. By that point, they were back in the Netherlands, and they tried to get custody of their legitimate child. And she or her caretaker did not want that to happen. And so she married a Malay man in order to claim that, now she was a married woman and that she could not go to the Netherlands to her parents. So this triggered legal questions surrounding her marital status. Was her Muslim marriage legal? And the courts, so it was still the British court at the time, ruled that it wasn't legal. And so that was seen as very much a declaration of war by the Malay population in Singapore. And this triggered this wave of really brutal riots that left a few people dead, actually. So why am I saying this? Because this is a time, as some Jews in Singapore have recounted, where people did not want to go on the street, right? It was very violent outside, and people didn't know what would happen in terms of harmony between the different groups and the political future of Singapore. So this is the kind of events that shows you really the mindset that people who were left in Singapore would have been in after the war. And in that context, you can see why people might have preferred to go to Australia rather than stay in Singapore. So among the people who went to Australia was actually members of the Marshall family themselves. So here it's a photo that was taken in Perth, Australia, after the war, of Sal Marshall, was David Marshall's dad, and his siblings. Farha, I think it was the David Marshall's name, is not on the picture. And because from what we understand, the Saul and Farha did not get along very well. And so actually, David Marshall's mom stayed in Singapore during the war, was interned during the war. And after the creation of Israel in 1948, she migrated to Israel. Okay, so now I want to go back to David Marshall. We don't have that much time, but I want to go back to the concept of Asian Jew. Because this identity as an Asian Jew, whether he was ascribed by the colonial authorities or a label that Jews themselves identified with, was really crucial in the intellectual and political development of David Marshall. So in an interview he gave in the 1980s, he said, "Politics was an accident. I was thrust into politics by a sense of outrage, a deep sense of anger. I used to resent little pinpricks which were, I thought, unfair about, the white man, brown man relationship. Like you call me Jew, Jowdy, Jew, brush my shoe, and next thing I know is I hit you in the nose. I wanted to break the sonic barrier against Asians and especially against Jews." So you can see here how David Marshall's really direct encounters with British anti-Semitism, because he was schooled in Christian schools, how those encounters really shaped him as a young man and really set him on the path to seek justice for colonized people. And he became really at the forefront of the movement towards decolonization, and particularly for the independence of Singapore. So this is really how he came to become the first chief minister of Singapore in the 1950s. And during the years when he was chief minister of Singapore, he actually worked very hard towards setting Singapore on the path towards full independence from Britain. So here are some pictures actually that show you David Marshall in Israel as chief minister. You might recognize someone who became truly the modern founder of post-colonial Singapore, who is Lee Kuan Yew. So Lee Kuan Yew is the man on the left side of the left picture. And you can see on the right side, the man right next to David Marshall is Lee Kuan Yew. Here we could also have a whole lecture about Lee Kuan Yew and David Marshall relationship. They had a fraught relationship. In his memoirs, Lee Kuan Yew actually describes David Marshall as a quote unquote flamboyant Sephardic Jew. So you can see that there were cultural and personality differences between the two men, and very different visions for Singapore. And ultimately, the vision that prevailed was Lee Kuan Yew's vision. But nonetheless, David Marshall very much left important traces on Singapore's political history. A very interesting moment in David Marshall's role as chief minister was also a trip that he undertook to China in 1956, where he met with the Chinese premier. And during his visit, he advocated for China to allow Jews in China, and it was primarily Russian Jews in China, to be able to leave China and migrate to Israel. And we actually have exceptional documents from his time in China, because during the few weeks that he was there, he wrote letters to one of his brothers. And those letters have been published in a book called Letters from Mao's China. And so you can really, hear David's perspective on China, and really hear, what his experiences would have been like in China in the mid 1950s. Okay, so we spoke about David Marshall, and what I wanted to really emphasize here is his political efforts towards Singapore's independence, but also his vision for a multiracial, inclusive Singapore. So in addition to his efforts as chief minister, David Marshall was really the person who articulated the idea of inclusive citizenship in Singapore, which would not be rooted in ethnic categories. So the idea that anyone, regardless of their origins, could become a Singaporean citizen. And this didn't really come into fruition until after he was chief minister. So the Singapore citizenship law, the ordinance passed in 1957, but he was really the person who articulated this in the first place and advocated for the Singapore citizenship law. Oh, and then of course, another thing I should mention about David Marshall is that in addition to his work as a politician and later on, really as a very, very well-known criminal lawyer, he was a lawyer for most of his life. In addition to this, he always remained very involved in the Jewish community. And he actually established, after the war, the Jewish Welfare Board, which was tasked with helping really the poorest members of the community who were left in Singapore and didn't, whose homes had been destroyed, they had nowhere to really go to. And David Marshall was really really pioneered the Jewish Welfare Board, which exists to this day. And he always remained close to the community. So I want to end with Phyllis Isaacs, because Phyllis Isaacs was really the first woman to play important roles in the life of the community as someone who was first the treasurer of the Jewish Welfare Board, and later on the president and vice president. And we should say at the outset that when she took up the role of treasurer of the Welfare Board in the 1960s, she herself was only in her 1930s, and she was actually taking care of 7 children because she remarried Frederick Isaacs, who had children from a previous marriage. So they had children from a previous marriage and had children together. So she had 7 children to take care of. She had a business to run with her husband. And in addition to this, she took on that role of, treasurer and all those other hats that she wore in the community. Among other actions, she was really central alongside her husband, Frederick Isaacs, with really preserving the Chesed synagogue. And so the Chesed synagogue has been renovated and it's gorgeous. It really is gorgeous. And it remains quite an active synagogue, even though people usually associate Singapore's community with Magen Avraham. The Chesed synagogue to this day still plays an important role. And this is really thanks to her efforts among others. So I think it's really important to highlight that. You can see on this photo here that she's standing right next to Yitzhak Rabin, who visited the community in 1993. So through her communal activism, she also got to meet important Israeli leaders who visited Singapore over the years. Okay, so I actually want to end with a quote from the oral interview that she gave to the National Archives in the 1980s. She said to the person who interviewed her, "Well, I've made a life in Singapore. I'm happy in Singapore. I've got my family, being here. I have found my husband here, and I'm quite happy having come down to Singapore. As far as I know, Singapore is my home. I have no other homes." And so I want to take the time here to just reflect on the life of a woman who was born in Surabaya, Indonesia, into an Arabic-speaking family, speaking Dutch and Malay, who was interned by the Japanese and ultimately decided that the place where she would want to make a home was Singapore. And through her family life and her communal activism, she made it happen. And our descendants, and that I think illustrates the fate of the Baghdadi diaspora in the modern era, is dispersed across many continents. She has, children and grandchildren in the US, Australia, etc. But she also has family here that remains in Singapore. And her great-granddaughters are my kids' best friends. And so this story is an ongoing story. And the pictures on the right side are medals of public, it's a medal of public service that is given by the Singapore government to honor people who have contributed to the lives of the community and the nation. And she was awarded one of them, and so was her husband, Frederick. So it's very clear that her efforts and her, communal and nation-building efforts were recognized not only within the community, but by the government itself. So we're going to stop here to make room for a question. But in closing, I want to return to the Mahala project and invite anyone who's interested in checking it out and reach out to us, please. If you have any stories or anything you need to share, our role is to really spotlight histories that have been forgotten and can tell us so much about um, cultural crossings and the multi-ethnic society. So we're really curious to hear from you. Lynn, I leave it at this so that we have time for Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Geraldine, for that excellent talk. I think it gave us such a wonderful sense of the community and the main characters in them who built the community. And of course, what happened during the war, and the fact it's really no longer a Baghdadi community as such, but more of an expat one nowadays. I wanted to just to mention that we have had a talk on Indonesia, the Jews of Indonesia, Surabaya. There is a recording. I can't tell you exactly what date it was, but it is on the Harif video channel. It was a lady from Australia called Deborah. I forget her surname now. But she was writing a book about the Jews of Indonesia and researching what happened during the war. And also, we've had a talk about the Jews of Borneo. And in fact, I'm very pleased to see that Rosalie Corpus is here with us on the call. She gave us a very good talk about those Jews. So it's amazing how Jews ended up, little pockets of Jews ended up all over the place in the Far East, and they have amazing stories to tell. So I just wanted to kick off with a question, Geraldine, and that is, did the British actually give British citizenship to the Jews of Singapore before the war?
Okay, this is such an interesting question. And it's a question that I think extends beyond Singapore itself. So, as I said earlier, we usually think of Baghdadi Jews as being fully anglicized. And in fact, many of them became British subjects. And in India, for instance, they were British subjects. So um, there are stories of people migrating for the purpose of having that legal status. Um, but it wasn't the case that all Baghdadi Jews acquired that legal status. And in fact, that status became important for the warriors. So, for instance, Maisie Mayer, I think you had Maisie for, she spoke about the Sassoon family, maybe in
That's
Shanghai.
right. That's right. She
So,
gave us a
so,
talk.
so Maisie has this incredible book about the Jews of Shanghai, which is a series of biographies of Shanghai Jews. And a lot of them actually deal with the question of citizenship. And she shows that actually in China, when Jews were interned, they were interned as British. So
Mm.
people who were former Ottoman subjects, or what later became Iraqi citizens, were not interned, but British subjects were. So what was an asset before the war turned out to be very much a liability during the war years. So why
Mm.
am I saying this? To say that there wasn't just one legal status, and it really depended on which part of the British Empire, and that it also depended on kind of where you fit on the social economic spectrum, right? Because of course, the British were much more interested in granting protection and status to people who they saw as bringing in, wealth and economic opportunities for the British Empire. So it's a great question, and to be perfectly honest, this is something that I really want to investigate further. What as far as Singapore is concerned. So if anyone has information on this, please do share with me.
And I put links to the videos on
Okay.
Borneo and Indonesia.
Oh,
the
excellent.
chat.
So there are links to those videos I mentioned
Oh,
in the chat.
great.
Yeah.
Lynn, sorry, Lynn, are you able to save the chat for future
Yes,
What I'll
reference?
do is
Yes.
I'll
Okay.
edit the chat and send it
yeah,
to you. But
yeah,
I'll
we
take
will
out
send it to you.
all the kind of rubbish comments.
Yeah. No, no. So talking about the British, I mean, you quoted that passage from David Marshall's book where he's obviously very aware of the prejudice that he encountered amongst the British. And we know that they wouldn't allow Jews into clubs, for instance,
Right.
and there was that kind of prejudice. And of course, some of them were denied citizenship, as you say. But it's fascinating to know if there were also tensions with the other ethnic groups. I mean, did they get on better with the Chinese or with the Malays or I mean, what was it like?
Well, that is a great question, and that's why Jen and I have become so invested in this Machala project, because the Machala, which was where really the poorest members of the community lived, it wasn't a Jewish enclave. It wasn't a ghetto or anything like this. It was a multicultural neighborhood. So they were, Chinese families, Indian families, Eurasian families, et cetera, et cetera. And these people lived together and, shared culture and daily life together. And in fact, you mentioned Jay's book. Jay's book is, one story of an encounter between people who came from two different groups. And his story is unique in the sense that his mom ended up formally joining the Jewish community. So there were many other stories of people who had romantic relationships with people outside of the Jewish community and they didn't necessarily pass on Judaism to the next generation. But all of this to say that this was a very interethnic place where that fostered a kind of um, inter, sorry, like very pluralistic cultural environment.
Mhm.
And in some way, it's interesting because this is the narrative that Singapore wants to promote and project today, right? This idea of racial harmony, etc. We know, looking back on the racial rights in the 50s, that it wasn't always the case that people got along. But despite those moments of tensions, there was also a lot of exchange across communities that
Right.
shaped also the Jewish community, of course.
Right. Yeah, I think in the comments, if you'd like to have a look, there's some discussion about the expression
Jacob Ellis.
Arab Jews. Oh, yeah, and Jacob
Yes,
Ballas.
I think Jacob Ellis. I'm so glad because this is someone I had in mind actually when we talked about Asian Jews, and I couldn't talk about everyone, but Jacob Ellis is a very important figure. Jacob Ellis is important among many reasons because he himself was born in the Mahala to a poor family and ended up becoming a very successful stockbroker. So it's really a rags to riches stories. He became very prominent, very wealthy, never married, and really donated a lot of his wealth to the Jewish community as well as to other philanthropic endeavors. So actually today, if you go to the Botanic Garden in Singapore, there is a garden devoted to like for kids, a children's garden named after him. It's called the Jacob Ballas Children's Garden, really to honor his memory. Next to the synagogue on the Magen Avraham compound, there's a building that was built a few years ago that has really become the heart of the Jewish community. It hosts a kosher shop, a banquet hall, etc., etc. And it's also named after Jacob Ballas. And so to tie this back to the question of Asian Jew, Jacob Ballas was someone who I believe used also the term Asian Jew himself to describe the ways in which Baghdadi Jews were not doing so well economically, were looked down upon not only by the wealthy members of the community, but also by the British.
Right. So Sarah points out Arab Jews was actually a colonial term, and it's noteworthy in 19th century Bombay, Baghdadi Jews referred to themselves as Jewish merchants of Arabia residing in Bombay and not as Arab Jews. And this comes from her mum's book, Rachel Manasseh's book, Baghdadian Jews of Bombay, which was published in 2014. So that's interesting. Um,
Great. That's a great remark. And the question of labels is so interesting because we talked about Asian Jew, Arab Jew, the
yeah,
question of how those labels have evolved, how they were used by colonial authorities and by Jews themselves. I mean, we could write a whole story about this, I think. because it really shows you the ambiguity of Baghdadi belonging in the British colonial sphere.
That's right. Yeah, that they didn't want to be associated necessarily with the Muslims, I suppose. That was the idea. They wanted to emphasize the fact that they were merchants above all, perhaps, um, and therefore tied to the British Empire. Yeah, sort of. Is there anything else on there? Jay makes the point that the Japanese didn't know how to classify Jews. They took instruction from the Germans to intern them. Yeah, I seem to remember from our talk on Indonesia that they had a very hard time of it, the Jews who were interned in camps.
Yes,
But
the conditions in those camps were yeah really very difficult.
very difficult, yeah. And you say about 50 Jews actually died during the occupation. I mean, in
Yeah,
intern.
you can see on the slide, and I'm happy to share
Yeah,
the slide. This is from AZ Nathan's book because he's
yeah,
you know he collected a lot of information on this. On the topic of collecting information, I also wanted to say that uh, I've really seen the Jews of Singapore Museum grow over the past few years, and I've become very interested in collecting further stories for the museum. We're discussing the possibility of having a screen with oral testimonies or excerpts of oral testimonies or videos, something that would bring to life the history with a bit more texture than just, traditional text on the wall. So if people have family documents, visual archives, anything that they want to bring to the attention of the museum, definitely reach out because it's important to preserve those stories.
right. Well, Professor Kerem is on the call and he says he has uh, testimonies of people tortured and shot by the Japanese. Well, he is a Holocaust scholar, so I mean, I can put you in touch with him.
Absolutely. Thank you. You
But
might be
his,
able to answer all of my questions.
yeah, he's got his email actually in the chat. And so that is really a neglected part of the Holocaust, isn't it? As you mentioned, we tend to concentrate on what happened in Europe to the Jews.
Well,
Um,
there is a growing, I think there is growing scholarship on the experiences of European Jews who took refuge in various parts of Asia. I'm thinking particularly of Shanghai, also a little bit about Hong Kong. So that
yeah,
is a growing field and a very important field. And in fact, Baghdadi Jews played a very important role as people who helped those European refugees,
yeah,
like Victor Sassoon in Shanghai, but also in India because
yeah,
they were Central European refugees who took refuge in India and were helped by Baghdadi Jews, right? But the story that gets forgotten is how Baghdadi Jews themselves were also victims during World War II. And
absolutely.
that, I think, is not a topic that people really know much about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So tell me, are you thinking of putting all your research into a book? I mean, what's going to happen to it?
Um, yes, okay. My book is a bit different, actually, because I'm really a historian of migration and family life and the law. So I'm interested in all those things interact with one another. And the first book, which I'm completing now, has nothing to do with Baghdadi Jews. It's about this very strange phenomenon whereby Russian Jews in France were not able to get divorces in really between 1905 and World War II, even though there was civil divorce in France and Halakha, Jewish law tolerates divorce, and Jews in Russia could divorce. So through this really strange legal phenomenon, I kind of unpack how the French state interacted with Russian migrants. So why am I saying this? Because this is really my interest, how my mobility and family and the law intersect, um, often to the exclusion of Jews to some degree. And what brought me to Baghdadi Jews is that because of my husband's job, we live in Singapore. And previously, we were in Malaysia, which has completely obscured its Jewish history, but actually has really rich Baghdadi Jewish history. in places like Penang and even Kuala Lumpur. And many years ago, when I was in my 20s, I worked for JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, as a Jewish Corps Fellow, no, Jewish Service Corps Fellow in Mumbai. So through those three different experiences, I kept encountering Baghdadi Jews, Baghdadi Jewish heritage in India, Malaysia, and now Singapore. And I thought to myself, okay, I must do something with this. So I'm combining my interest in Baghdad, in the Baghdadi Jewish diaspora, with my scholarly interest in families. So this book I'm writing now really is about Baghdadi Jewish family life. And I look at legal cases involving Baghdadi Jews in British court surrounding questions of divorce, custody, betrothal. So I found, for instance, to give you a taste of it, I found this case of a woman in 1930s India who came to the British court because she had married a Baghdadi Jew from India by proxy in Basra. So she actually was approached by his family in Basra because the family was originally from Basra before they settled in India. So he sent off his his sister and mother to find him a bride. They found this young woman, Naja, who agreed to doing a marriage by proxy, a betrothal by proxy. Except when she finally came to Bombay, she realized that she wanted to have nothing to do with her alleged husband. And so she approached the court to have the court declare that they were not married because the betrothal by proxy wasn't actually a marriage, even though according to Jewish law, it is very much a marriage. And so this is the kind of case that really sheds light on the questions of mobility and how Baghdadi Jews interacted with the British courts and the very complex interactions between British law and Jewish law. So the book is really about that. Really question of how do you build families in a context of hypermobility where you live in a small, like Singapore, for instance, was a small community. So people usually had to find brides somewhere else.
Yes.
So what did that look like? What kind of issues did that create for the people involved, especially for the women involved? So trying to kind of bring women back into the story here.
Yeah.
So that is the book project, but we'll see how things evolve.
Wonderful. So that's a whole new topic for us, I think. Okay, that's lovely. Well, I don't want to keep you up anymore because you must be exhausted. What time it is now?
It is 4 a.m.
4 a.m.
So.
Yes, and you've got little ones as well. You'll be up in about an hour.
I don't want to think about this. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Really, such a delight to, and to get everyone's feedback and comments. That is exceedingly helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
Okay, so as is our custom.
Then I have to take some people out, darling.
Oh dear. Okay, there are the name.